President Trump thought it would be light-hearted, just a panel, a few laughs, and a dig at the British Guard seated beside him. So when he leaned into the mic and said, "These guys just stand there, right? Like statues. I mean, even my wife couldn't get past one of them," the audience chuckled. But the guard didn't. He sat stone still, until Trump joked one too many times. Then, for the first time in his 30-year career, and against every rule of protocol, Sergeant Declan Rowe spoke. Not with outrage and not with insults, but with a truth neither Trump nor Melania ever expected to hear out loud. And what he said next, on live television, with the world watching, left Trump visibly shaken, not mocked, not clapped back, exposed. Now, before we show you what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's get into it. The autumn evening had settled over St. James's Palace, with that particular London chill that makes old stone buildings feel even more ancient. Camera crews worked quietly in the East Drawing Room, threading cables across Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, while studio lights cast warm pools across polished wood that had witnessed centuries of diplomatic conversations. About 60 people filtered through multiple security checkpoints, diplomats, donors, embassy staff, settling into chairs arranged around what looked like the world's most expensive coffee table. They called it a ceremonial panel with the safest possible theme: Tradition and Alliance, a century of UK-US relations. Nothing controversial, just handshakes, anecdotes, and the kind of polite conversation that fills diplomatic dinner parties. The producers had briefed everyone. Keep it light, keep it positive, maybe share a funny story or two about cultural differences. President Donald J. Trump had been first to accept the invitation. The former president, campaigning through Europe, loved the optics. Royalty, red carpets, Union Jacks positioned perfectly behind his chair. "It's going to look very classy," his aide had whispered into a mic backstage, adjusting Trump's tie for the third time in 10 minutes. Alongside him sat two carefully chosen voices: Professor Margaret Whitfield from Oxford, a historian who specialised in making dry, diplomatic treaties sound like page-turning novels, and Sarah Chen, a television culture analyst known for her gentle but sharp observations about protocol and pageantry. Both women had been briefed to keep things conversational, educational, entertaining. At the far left, deliberately underlit, sat Sergeant Declan Rowe, retired Coldstream Guard, 54, in full ceremonial dress, scarlet tunic, crisp black trousers with red stripe, bearskin hat folded in his lap. But if you knew what to look for, subtle details told a different story. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher, compensating for shrapnel doctors never quite removed. The faint scar running from ear to collar. Hands that had carried more than ceremonial rifles. Declan had grown up above his grandmother's shop in Bermondsey, memorizing names of relatives who'd died in wars he'd only read about. His father drove the number 12 bus for 28 years, teaching him that real strength doesn't announce itself, son, it just stands. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him how to spot danger, sleep through mortar fire, write letters to families whose sons weren't coming home. His 3rd deployment, still classified, taught him the most important lesson. Sometimes the most crucial work looks like nothing to everyone watching. Tonight he was meant to be set dressing. His invitation came with a note: "We hope you'll bring dignity to the room." For the first 18 minutes, he didn't speak once. Sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on that distant point guards learn to focus on, beyond cameras, beyond politics, beyond temporary drama. Trump was in his element from moment one, waving to cameras, praising British hospitality, calling the palace one of the finest rooms I've ever been in, maybe the best, honestly. The moderator, Julia Fitzgerald, guided safe conversation about state dinners and cultural exchanges. Trump was generous with praise, calling the changing of the guard incredible theatre and sharing stories about tea with the Queen. The studio relaxed. This was what they'd expected: pleasant, educational, safe. Then Trump's attention shifted, the way it always did when he'd been talking about other people too long. He leaned forward with that particular smirk people who knew him recognized as a warning sign. "You know, Melania once had a bit of a moment with one of these chaps, a guard, real professional type, Wouldn't let her through for a photo. Can you believe that? The audience chuckled uncertainly. Trump warmed to the story, gesturing with practiced ease. She was all dressed up, looking absolutely stunning, wanted to walk across this courtyard for a magazine shoot. Just a few steps, nothing dramatic. Professional photographers, beautiful setup. More laughter, more confident now. And this guy, Trump continued, glancing toward Declan, just stared straight ahead, wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, like she was invisible. The camera panned to Declan's profile, still motionless, still focused on that distant point. Trump chuckled, shaking his head. I mean, come on! You're telling me this isn't performance art? Look at that outfit! I've done television! I know set pieces when I see them. Julia tried to steer back to the program's theme, but Trump wasn't finished. When you're spending 8 hours standing still in a hat that weighs more than some dogs, you're not exactly running counter-terrorism operations. Louder laughter. People relaxed into the amusement. Professor Whitfield cleared her throat. Tradition has its own discipline, Mr. President. Sometimes the most important work doesn't announce itself. Trump waved off the comment. Discipline's great, but let's not confuse standing still with speaking truth. I like people who use their voices when it matters. The camera slowly zoomed toward Declan. Something in the air had shifted, not dramatic, more like a gear preparing to click into place. Julia caught it. Sergeant Rowe, would you like to offer any perspective? Declan didn't answer immediately. The only sound was equipment humming and 60 people holding their breath. But in the control room, a red light blinked on. Declan's microphone was now live. Trump had found his rhythm. He praised the pageantry and precision, getting comfortable laughs. It's like Broadway, but with better costumes and no intermission. But then he shifted gears. Speaking of commitment, Melania found out firsthand how seriously these guys take their duties. The atmosphere changed subtly. This was a few years back. She was here for a European magazine shoot. Gorgeous setup, professional photographers, perfect lighting. He gestured toward Declan. And apparently one of your guards was stationed right where they needed to film. So, Melania approaches looking absolutely stunning, and she just needs to cross this area for the shot. Trump paused for effect. This guy didn't move, didn't acknowledge her, just stared ahead like she wasn't even there. Scattered, uncertain laughter. I get it. Duty is duty. But we're talking about the First Lady of the United States. A little acknowledgement wouldn't have killed anyone. His voice grew more animated. She tried to get his attention, very politely. Just a simple, "Excuse me." Nothing happened. Guy might as well have been carved from stone. Studio had gone quieter, people listening more intently. So finally, one of the photographers explains the situation, shows him permits, the whole 9 yards. Another pause. Still nothing. They had to redesign the entire shoot because one guy in a funny hat wouldn't move 10 feet. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. Trump leaned into it. Look, I respect the commitment. But at some point, you have to ask, what exactly are these guys guarding? A stone wall? His voice took on presidential authority. I've commanded the most powerful military in the world. I've worked with generals who've made actual life and death decisions. Real leadership knows when to adapt. He gestured more firmly at Declan. Standing around for 8 hours, looking pretty for tourists, that's not service. That's pageantry. Then came the line that changed everything. These guys are basically very expensive lawn ornaments. The silence that followed was different from all the others. A line had been crossed in front of witnesses. The far left of the panel, Sergeant Declan Rowe finally moved. Just a slow, deliberate turn of his head until his eyes met Trump's. "You're absolutely right, sir," he said, his voice crystal clear. "I didn't let your wife through." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the studio lights humming overhead. Trump looked momentarily pleased, like someone who'd finally gotten the response he'd been angling for. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Confession time. He turned toward the audience with a grin that suggested they were all about to be entertained. Maybe we'll get the real story now. Let's hear it, Sergeant. Was she just not important enough for the Queen's Guard? The audience chuckled nervously, caught between the expectation of humour and the growing sense that something more serious was unfolding. Julia looked at her teleprompter, then at her notes, then at the control booth. None of them offered any guidance for whatever this was becoming. Declan shifted slightly in his chair. Not a break in composure, but the kind of subtle adjustment that happens when someone prepares to carry a heavier weight. "I'd like 60 seconds, he said quietly. Trump's eyebrows went up, and his grin widened. 60 seconds? Sure, go ahead. Let's hear from the Queen's Guard. Make it good." The audience settled back in their chairs, expecting either a dry ceremonial explanation or perhaps a respectfully worded defense of protocol, something that would restore the comfortable atmosphere and let everyone return to safe diplomatic territory. Instead, Declan leaned forward just slightly, his hands remaining perfectly still on the table, and spoke with the calm precision of someone delivering a briefing on matters of life and death. "March 17th, 2018, he began. There was a classified diplomatic meeting occurring in the East Wing of Clarence House. Russian Federation representatives were being quietly intercepted under joint UK-US intelligence protocols. Our standing orders were specific. No civilian access to that corridor. No exceptions." The studio went from comfortable quiet to absolute silence in the space of a heartbeat. "Your wife," Declan continued, his eyes never leaving Trump's face, "approached the restricted entrance at approximately 2:47 p.m. She was unaccompanied by cleared personnel. She carried no visible identification. She ignored posted restriction signage in both English and diplomatic notation." Trump's grin was beginning to falter around the edges. "I was briefed at 1400 hours by a direct liaison from the security service," Declan said, each word measured and deliberate. "No civilian entry, no engagement unless physically obstructed, no deviation from posted orders under any circumstances." He paused, letting that information settle into the growing tension. "I followed those orders. I didn't move because I wasn't permitted to move. I didn't speak because operational security demanded silence." The historian at the panel table had gone completely still, her pen suspended above her notepad. Sarah Chen's eyes had widened slightly, not with shock, but with the recognition that she was hearing something she'd never expected to hear on live television. "The breach attempt was logged," Declan continued in the same steady tone. "Your wife's name was omitted from official documentation for diplomatic reasons, but the incident was recorded, investigated, and filed under national security protocols." He looked directly at Trump now, his expression unchanged, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You turned that security incident into entertainment, a story about disrespectful guards and demanding protocol. You've told it at rallies, dinner parties, and interviews for 7 years. The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. "I was following orders that kept foreign intelligence operatives from accessing classified materials. Your wife was attempting to enter a secure area during an active counterintelligence operation." Declan's voice dropped slightly, but somehow carried even more clearly. "You turned my duty into your punchline." The studio didn't just go quiet, it went dead. Not a cough, not a shift in seating, not even the sound of breathing, just the electric hum of equipment and the weight of words that couldn't be taken back. Trump opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. For perhaps the first time in recent memory, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. Julia tried to interject, her professional instincts kicking in. "Sergeant Rowe, these are quite serious allegations." But Trump found his voice first, and it came out sharper than he probably intended. Wait just a minute. You're saying Melania was trying to access classified information. You're calling the First Lady a security threat?" Declan didn't flinch. "I'm saying she attempted to enter a restricted area during an active operation. Whether she knew the nature of the restriction is irrelevant to my duty." "This is ridiculous," Trump said, his voice rising slightly. "You're talking about wife like she's some kind of spy. She was doing a photo shoot, a magazine spread about international fashion and diplomacy." "Yes, sir," Declan replied calmly, "in a corridor that was temporarily classified as a secure zone due to ongoing intelligence operations." Trump leaned forward aggressively. "And nobody thought to tell us that? Nobody thought to mention that the area was off limits?" For the first time since he'd begun speaking, Declan's expression changed. Not to anger or accusation, but to something that might have been pity. Your advance team was briefed at 0900 hours that morning. The restriction was communicated through proper diplomatic channel. Your wife was accompanied by personnel who had been informed of the limitations. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying this truth for far too long. The choice to ignore those briefings and attempt access anyway was made by your team. The choice to turn that moment into a story about disrespectful guards was yours alone. Trump's face had flushed slightly, and his hands moved restlessly on the table. You don't talk to a former president like that. You're out of line. I'm under oath to tell the truth when directly questioned about matters of national security, Declan replied, without missing a beat. You asked for my account. This is my account. The words hit the studio like a physical force. Even the cameramen had stopped adjusting their equipment, caught in the gravity of what they were witnessing. For 7 years, Declan continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. You've told a story where I'm the rigid fool who couldn't show basic courtesy to an important woman. You've used it to mock British protocol, to question the value of tradition, to get laughs from audiences who don't know the context. He leaned back slightly, but his eyes never left Trump's face. Every time you told that story, you made my job harder. You made it harder for people to understand that sometimes standing still is the most important thing we can do, that sometimes silence protects more than speeches ever could. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was profound. The kind of stillness that happens when truth collides with performance and truth wins. Trump tried one more time, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Even if that's all true, even if there was some kind of security thing, you could have been polite about it. You could have explained. I could have compromised an active intelligence operation to spare your wife's feelings, Declan interrupted quietly. Yes, sir, I could have done that. He let that hang in the air for a moment before adding, but I didn't, because that's not what I swore to do. The moderator had given up trying to control the conversation. The historian was staring at her hands. The cultural analyst was taking notes furiously, as if trying to capture something she knew she'd never see again. And in the control booth, someone was frantically checking to make sure all of this was actually being broadcast live. Trump sat back in his chair, his expression cycling through several emotions too quickly to track. The confident showman who'd entered the studio an hour earlier seemed to have shrunk somehow, replaced by someone who was rapidly calculating how much damage had just been done. Declan waited, perfectly still again for whatever would come next. But the studio already knew. Even before the words were spoken, even before the credits rolled, everyone present understood that they'd just witnessed something that would outlive whatever political theatre had brought them all together in the first place. They'd seen what happens when truth finally gets tired of being entertainment. And it was beautiful. The aftermath didn't unfold in dramatic fashion. No shouting match, no storming off stage, no theatrical gestures. Instead, it settled over the studio like fog, heavy, inescapable, transforming everything it touched. Trump sat motionless for nearly 30 seconds, which might have been the longest he'd gone without speaking in a television studio since the 1980s. His mouth worked silently, his hands drummed against the table, and his eyes kept darting between Declan and the camera, as if he were trying to calculate something that kept coming up with the wrong answer. Finally he managed, "So what you're telling me is that this was all some kind of spy movie situation, and nobody thought to give us better communication." His voice had lost its earlier confidence, carrying instead the defensive tone of someone who'd found themselves in a hole and couldn't stop digging. Declan's response was devastating in its simplicity. "The communication was clear, sir. The choice to ignore it was also clear." Julia tried desperately to regain control of her program. "Perhaps we should..." But Trump wasn't finished. He'd built his entire career on never backing down, even when backing down was the only rational choice. And those instincts were stronger than strategy. "You know what I think," he said, pointing across the table with renewed aggression. "I think you're making this whole thing up. I think you're covering for the fact that you were rude to the First Lady, and now you're spinning some elaborate story about Russian spies to make yourself look important." The words came out too fast, too desperate, and they landed in the studio like broken glass. Someone in the audience, and a woman in the third row, actually gasped, not loudly but audibly enough that the microphones caught it. Declan didn't even blink. "The incident report is available through the Freedom of Information Act," he said calmly. "Reference number GCHQ 2018-0317 Clarence. Your wife's attempt to access the restricted area is documented, along with the security response and subsequent diplomatic notifications to your administration." He paused, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, allowed himself the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I'd encourage you to request those files, Mr. President. I think you'll find them illuminating." Trump's face went through several color changes, none of them flattering under the studio lights. "You can't just throw around classified documents references. The classification was lifted 6 months ago," Declan interrupted gently. "Standard procedure after the operational window closes. The files are public record now." The sound you could hear in the studio wasn't quite silence anymore. It was the collective intake of breath from 60 people who'd just realized they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Professor Whitfield slowly set down her pen and looked at Trump with the expression of someone watching a historical event unfold in real time. Sarah Chen had stopped taking notes entirely and was just staring, her mouth slightly open. Julia made one final attempt at damage control. "I think we should." "No," Trump said, his voice cracking slightly. "No, let me get this straight. You're sitting here on live television accusing my administration of ignoring security protocols." Declan's voice remained perfectly steady. "I'm sitting here telling you that your administration was properly briefed, chose to proceed anyway, and then spent 7 years turning the consequences into entertainment." The pause that followed seemed to stretch into geological time. "I'm telling you that every time you told that story, you made people laugh at duty, at tradition, at the idea that some things matter more than convenience." His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but somehow filled the entire room. "I'm telling you that you turned my service into your setup line." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was profound, sacred almost. The kind of quiet that happens when truth has finally been spoken and there's nothing left to argue about. Trump tried one more time, his voice smaller now. Even if there was miscommunication, you could have handled it differently. You could have been more diplomatic." Declan looked at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of 30 years in uniform. "Sir," he said quietly, "I was diplomatic. I was so diplomatic that you never knew how close your wife came to being detained by armed security. I was so diplomatic that the incident never made the international news. I was so diplomatic that your administration's failure to follow basic security protocols never became a diplomatic crisis." He leaned forward slightly. "And in return, you made me the punchline in a story about arrogant guards who don't know their place." The studio lights seemed to dim, though nobody had touched any controls. The weight of what had just been said settled over everyone present like a blanket. Trump had no response. For perhaps the first time in his public life, he'd encountered someone who'd outmaneuvered him not with louder words or bigger gestures, but with simple, unassailable truth. Julia finally found her voice. I think we're going to take a break here." But nobody moved. Not the audience, not the panel, not even the camera operators. They all understood they'd just witnessed something that television couldn't contain. The red light on the camera stayed on. The broadcast continued. And in living rooms and pubs and office break rooms across 2 continents, people stopped whatever they were doing and watched in silence as truth finally had its moment. Because some stories aren't entertainment. Some stories are reckoning. And this one had been 30 years in the making. The lights didn't fade. The music didn't swell. There was no dramatic conclusion, no decisive victory, no moment when good triumphed over evil in clear, satisfying terms. Instead, there was just the slow realization settling over everyone in that studio that they'd witnessed something that couldn't be unseen or unheard. The kind of moment that doesn't make headlines because it's too real, too complicated, too human for the machinery of modern media to process properly. Trump sat in his chair, smaller somehow than he'd been an hour earlier, while his team of advisors whispered urgently among themselves near the edge of the set. His phone buzzed constantly. Texts, calls, emails from people who'd been watching and understood that something significant had just happened, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. Declan remained exactly where he'd been throughout the entire broadcast. Hands folded, back straight, eyes once again focused on that distant point that guards learn to see. He'd said what needed to be said, and now he was simply present, the way he'd been trained to be for 3 decades. The audience filed out slowly, quietly, like people leaving church after a sermon that had hit too close to home. They didn't chatter or laugh or check their phones. They just moved with the careful steps of people processing something unexpected. A young woman who worked for the BBC approached the edge of the set and caught Declan's attention. "Sergeant Rowe," she said quietly, "would you be willing to—" "No," he said, not unkindly. "Thank you." He stood, straightened his tunic with practiced precision, and walked toward the side exit. Not hurrying, not hiding, just moving with the same measured pace he'd maintained for the entire evening. As he passed Trump's chair, the former president looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not anger anymore, not defensiveness, something closer to recognition, perhaps. Or exhaustion. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Declan walked through the side door and into the London evening, where autumn air carried the scent of rain and distant traffic. He didn't check his phone, didn't look for cameras, didn't pause for the photographers who'd gathered outside. He simply walked to the corner, hailed a taxi, and went home. Behind him, in the studio that was slowly emptying of equipment and people, and the electric tension that had filled it for the past hour, the story continued to unfold in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Within 6 hours, the clip would be viewed by 12 million people. Within 24 hours, someone would locate and publish the declassified incident report Declan had referenced. Within a week, 3 investigative journalists would have assembled a timeline that confirmed every detail of his account. But none of that mattered to the man sitting in the back of a black cab, watching London scroll past through rain-streaked windows. He'd kept his word. He'd told the truth when directly asked. He'd maintained his dignity and his duty, even when both had been mocked for the entertainment of strangers. The taxi driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "You're that guard, aren't you? From the telly just now?" Declan met his gaze briefly. "I'm a retired guard." The driver nodded. "My dad was army. Never talked about it much, but he always said the real soldiers were the ones who knew when to stay quiet and when to speak up." He paused at a red light and turned around slightly. "Reckon you got the timing right on that one." Declan didn't respond, but something in his expression might have been agreement. The light turned green, and they drove on through the London night, where millions of people were discovering that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground and tell the truth, even when it takes 30 years to find the right moment to do it. So what do you think? Should Sergeant Rowe have stayed silent about what really happened that day? Or was Trump's public mockery of his duty finally enough to justify breaking that silence? When someone turns your service into their punchline, how long should you let it go on before you set the record straight? And what would you have done if you'd been sitting in that chair, watching years of quiet professionalism get mocked for cheap laughs? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And conversations like these remind us why stories about real service matter more than celebrity gossip ever could. If this moment hit you the way it hit us, if it reminded you that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is simply telling the truth, go ahead and smash that like button. It helps more people see stories like this one. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel with notifications turned on, because we bring you new Royal Guard stories every single day. Stories that show what happens when duty meets disrespect, when tradition faces down celebrity, when quiet dignity finally decides it's time to speak. And if you know someone who still thinks those red uniforms are just for tourists, someone who could use a reminder about what real service looks like, share this video with them. They might learn something. We've got another incredible story waiting for you right now. Just click the video on your screen, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. And when it finally speaks, the whole world stops to listen.